Hi, I'm Matt Frank, Secretary of the Wisconsin DNR. Baiting and feeding of deer is illegal in 26 Wisconsin counties. I am asking all Wisconsin hunters and citizens to join in the effort to enact a statewide ban of this practice.
Wisconsinites have strong opinions about white-tailed deer and deer management, and the controversy surrounding baiting and feeding of deer is no exception. The recent discoveries of diseases affecting deer herds in Wisconsin and its neighboring states have prompted changes to baiting and feeding laws in the region, bringing the issue into the spotlight. This video examines the impact of baiting and feeding to Wisconsin's deer herd and ecosystems, and builds a solid case for the legislative change that would put an end to baiting and feeding of deer. It's likely that some level of baiting and feeding has always existed in Wisconsin, particularly in the North Woods. But until recently, these activities were not widespread. This was probably due to the common perception that baiting deer in order to hunt them was illegal. The feeding of deer took place for the most part at resorts and restaurants. From the 1930s through the early 1950s, the Wisconsin Conservation Department conducted a winter deer feeding program. This program was implemented in response to public demand that the department supply feed to support the overly large deer herd in northern Wisconsin. However, feeding programs were not considered a valid deer management practice by wildlife professionals. As the deer herd grew and disease management became a major issue, it became clear to professional wildlife managers and most hunters that baiting and feeding are not appropriate management techniques or recreational practices. Across the nation, most states have acted on this understanding. 25 states have a complete ban on baiting for deer hunting. 12 states, including Wisconsin, have partial restrictions, and only 13 states currently have no restrictions. Wildlife experts make a clear distinction between food plots and plantings on one hand and baiting and feeding on the other. For example, food plots do not concentrate food or deer the way a feeding station does. As a result, deer-to-deer contact is much less likely in a food plot, and the possibility of disease transmission is greatly reduced. In the 1980s and 90s, the use of bait for hunting grew more common. Recent surveys of Wisconsin deer hunters reveal that 17% of gun hunters and 40% of bow hunters use bait. However, the use of bait is not uniform across all of Wisconsin. The use of baiting as a hunting tool is much more frequent in the north, where 24% of gun deer hunters report using bait. The Department of Natural Resources has the authority to prohibit baiting and feeding in counties where chronic wasting disease has been detected and in adjacent counties. Currently, this ban on baiting and feeding includes 26 counties, but most major conservation groups in the state, including the Conservation Congress, the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, and Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation, strongly support a statewide prohibition.
More recently, we've seen other organizations getting involved in the question of baiting and feeding. We've had some of the ag agencies. We've also been joined by organizations like the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation and other conservation organizations. Traditional bow hunters and different groups have come out in opposition to continued baiting and feeding. But we've been joined more recently by some of the ag groups who are concerned about animal health issues, and that may be the issue that ultimately kicks the baiting and feeding argument to a point where we have to have a decisive decision and in a quick way.
The presence of chronic wasting disease in Wisconsin and the presence of bovine tuberculosis in Michigan and Minnesota pose very real threats to Wisconsin's deer herd, hunting culture, and agriculture industry. Bait and feed piles concentrate large numbers of deer in very small areas. At high concentration levels, deer-to-deer contact is increased, thus increasing the risk of disease transmission from one deer to another. Chronic wasting disease and tuberculosis can also be spread by infectious agents left behind by diseased deer, which might be eaten by the next deer to visit the bait pile. Tuberculosis is also known to spread between wild deer and livestock. Minnesota and Michigan have confirmed tuberculosis in both wild deer and cattle. Tuberculosis in wild Wisconsin deer could have a large negative impact on our $34 billion livestock industry, including requiring the testing of all cattle at a cost of $12 a head.
as we've known over a long period of time, whenever you congregate animals of any kind, whether domestic livestock or wildlife, the likelihood of them exchanging diseases and passing it on is much greater. And obviously for livestock, we counteract that by going through a lot of different vaccination programs and dealing with that way and controlling those diseases. That obviously isn't practical with wildlife, but when you encourage deer to congregate in a area by feeding them there, and then they do come to that area naturally through that incentive, they're much more likely to share diseases. A larger percentage of the herd would be affected, and there are species of wildlife that transmit or can transmit that to livestock. And that's when it becomes a great risk for us as livestock producers.